So it's fun to talk to you today about not just women in the Bible, because I think that's a misnomer, but how relationships and gender sort of function in these literary texts and stories and poetry. And it'll be interesting to see sort of the differences between these characters and how they play out in the Hebrew Bible and against a sort of ancient Near Eastern background, and the New Testament against the sort of Greco-Roman world, since you're an expert in the New Testament and I work on the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, I'm excited for our conversation. So let's start off then by taking a look at the figure of Sarah. She seems to have a pretty mixed role in that she both is subject and subjugated and subjugating. So she's the wife of, but she also seems to have quite a bit of power on her own. She is Hagar's quote-unquote master. What do you make of this person?
So I think it's really interesting to talk about these different kinds of relationships with respect to power. And I think that is going to be a theme that we see throughout, how power functions in the story world, how it functions with respect to gender, and it's not a flat thing. So we might tend to have very stereotyped ideas about how women characters in the Bible are depicted, right? They might be always subjugated or always under the thumb or totally powerless or totally without agency. And that's not exactly the case. But something else that I think will be an important thing for us to orient ourselves to how gender works in these stories is that these are literary texts, right? They're stories. So the story needs certain devices to unfold in the way that it does. And for that reason, it doesn't necessarily depict, the real sort of, what might have been normal or what might have been even ideal in the ancient world, but more of what can be taken from the real world of the authors and then deployed in such a way that it makes the stories meaningful. Right. So Sarah's a really interesting character in that sense because Sarah is, a wife, but she also brings with her property, right? And when I talk about property, obviously we're speaking about enslaved persons, and we have to be sensitive about the history and the reception of that. But Hagar is her enslaved member of her household that she brings along with her when she's incorporated into Abraham's household. And actually, if we look at Genesis 16, I'd just like to read a little bit. Sarai, Abram's wife, so this is before they become Sarah and Abraham. Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Look, the Lord has kept me from bearing." And this is actually something that I hope we get to talk about a little bit more, which is this plot device of infertility or barrenness. Yeah. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it carries through to the New Testament.
Oh yeah, there's definite echo of that in one particular story.
Okay, so that will be
we'll get to that.
That'll be a fun thing to talk about. So Sarai said to Abram, "Look, the Lord has kept me from bearing." But what's the solution that she poses? She says, "Consort with my maid. Perhaps I shall have a son through her." And already here, there's a number of things that we will touch on later, which has to do with the importance of the continuation of a male line, right? And the role that women play in the perpetuation of a line. So in any case, and Abram heeded Sarai's request. So this is interesting because Sarai is actually, in a certain sense, giving orders to her husband. So we see sort of like a flipping already of authority.
And she's outsourcing a womb. And that's her property in such a profound manner that she can use this woman's body as her own, and it's legitimate. It would be considered through that a legitimate heir then for the line.
Right. I think
for the story.
Right.
Not
of course.
to mine this for legal status.
Right. But something that's really interesting also is the role that external items play And again, I have to like sort of apologize for the politics of the text, right? That a human being, an enslaved person here, is being used as an item, right? But that is sort of the way that of course, also Hagar has her own agency, as we see later as the story unfolds, that a person's quote unquote property become like their clothing is an extension of themselves. So Hagar is a kind of extension of Sarai's will. So, and Abram heeded Sarai's request. So Sarai, Abram's wife, took her maid, Hagar the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt in the land of Canaan 10 years, and gave her to her husband Abram as concubine. And something that the Hebrew here would, if a person reading this text in Hebrew would attend to, is that the verb that's used to give someone, to give someone over it's a marriage brokerage. She's actually brokering her own maid in marriage, in a kind of marriage type relationship to Abram. And so that is another way in which Sarai sort of upending expectations, gendered expectations of power, because who brokers marriages? Fathers, and then in the case of no father, brothers. So this is also a sort of upending.
So she's masculinized in a way through this action.
Yes,
yeah.
well, we could think of power as sort of the same structure that's nested, right? So we can see the father as the head of the household, who brokers marriages, who makes decisions on behalf of the whole family, a king as like a father, right? And God also in this like sort of like grand nested power configuration. So Sarai is actually like taking on this, it is a masculine role, but that's also part of the way power is depicted in this culture, right? So he cohabited with Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was lowered in her esteem. So this is interesting, right? That he cohabited with Hagar, and she conceived. And this is precisely what Sarai wanted. And yet it creates this tension. And this is another sort of theme that we see replicated in other stories of sort of rival wives or women who are vying for position in a household, that bearing a male child will put someone in a higher position. And so we see again here sort of like power being renegotiated in the household, right? And Sarai said to Abram, "The wrong done to me is your fault. I myself put my maid in your bosom. Now she sees that she is pregnant, and I am lowered in her esteem. The Lord decide between you and me." Abram said to Sarai, "Your maid is in your hands. Deal with her as you think right." Then Sarai treated her harshly, and she ran away from her. And so this is sort of how like that little piece of the episode ends, with Sarai, taking on, sort of reasserting herself in the role of authority. And this is just a great example to show how there's no such thing as a sort of paradigmatic story in the biblical narratives of how power functioned in the ancient world, or how gender sort of played out in the ancient world, because each of these stories is playing on already expectations that an audience would have had, right? Expectations that, maybe if a woman was brought into a household, that she would still be under the ultimate authority of the father of the household, and not necessarily, the woman under whom she came into the household.
Yeah.
So something else that's interesting about Sarai, though, is that in other points of the narrative, she doesn't have this kind of agency or authority. And so I want to go back to an earlier story, which is in Genesis 12. So this is the story where Abram and Sarai have to go down into Egypt.
Oh, right. And her beauty is a problem.
Yes. So this is really interesting because beauty, like clothing, is sort of externally worn. And this is another sort of theme that I think is missing when people are reading the texts, and they assume that characterization and characters actually function the way that they function for us as modern people. That there's this sort of rich interior emotional world that people are working out and regulating, and in fact this isn't the case, right? Beauty is an external manifestation of divine favor, of how someone might be necessarily better than someone else, or the recipient, anyone who has more wealth, more beauty is kind of in this conventional sense thought to be more gifted by God. So Sarai goes down into Egypt with Abram, and in this version of the story, and I say this version of the story because we found among the Dead Sea Scrolls an Aramaic version of the text that actually retells Sarai with much more agency. So in this version, Sarai goes down into Egypt with Abram, and he says, "Please say that you are my sister, so that I may live," so that he can be the brother to broker the marriage between Sarai and the Pharaoh. But actually, Sarai doesn't actually say anything in this whole story. And in the Genesis Apocryphon version, it's totally flipped, where she comes to Abram in a dream and comes up with this idea to trick them into thinking that they're brother and sister. And so
It's interesting that that's a dream, though, because that adds a film over her agency, because you could say this is not really she who is acting. So it cushions that sort of, I don't know.
It might be if we were, again, thinking about dreams in this sort of internal state.
That's true.
Like things that happen to us, right, from us. But actually in the ancient world, dreams were sort of phenomena in which others would visit you. And so it's a kind of...
So it is her.
It is her.
Yeah.